It begins with a lie so perfect, so carefully constructed, that an entire kingdom bowed before it without ever seeing the cracks. They called her Gloriana, the Virgin Queen, the shining light of a golden age. But behind the white mask and royal pageantry was a woman who had been taught since birth to bury every scream, every sob, every soft part of herself, because softness got you killed. The truth, Elizabeth Tudor, crowned Queen of England at 25, wasn't just a political mastermind. She was a survivor of betrayal, grooming, near execution, and heartbreak so brutal that she built an entire monarchy on the ruins of her own desire. And when she couldn't have love, she made damn sure no one else could either. She was born in the fall of 1533, to a mother who would soon be decapitated, and a father who would erase her existence with the stroke of a quill. 11 days after Anne Boleyn's head hit the scaffold, little Elizabeth was declared illegitimate, erased from the line of succession, and exiled from court life. The infant, who had once been dressed in cloth of gold and laid in a silver cradle, became a political inconvenience, shuffled into the background like a stain no one wanted to acknowledge. That was lesson 1. Royalty meant nothing if you didn't have power and love. No matter how pretty, I wouldn't save you. Her second lesson came in the form of a man in a nightgown, Thomas Seymour, her stepmother's husband. Elizabeth was 14. He was in his 30s. Every morning, he'd burst into her room in nothing but his robe, tickling her, slapping her rear, calling it fun. Sometimes, her stepmother Catherine Parr laughed along, but soon, the laughs turned to whispers, and the whispers to fear. When the Queen caught them embracing, Elizabeth was banished. The scandal almost ruined her. It didn't, but it taught her something far more useful: trust. No one, not even the ones who say they love you, especially not them. By the time she was locked in the Tower of London in 1554, accused of plotting against her own sister, Elizabeth had become an expert at silence. The Tower was where her mother had died. It smelled of death and betrayal, and she knew, deep in her bones, that if she wept or begged or faltered for even a second, she'd never walk out. So she stared her captors down, refused to crack, wrote letter after letter to Mary Tudor, each one a masterpiece of pleading and manipulation. "I am your true and humble sister," she wrote, but she knew better. Sisters didn't save each other in this world. When Mary died in 1558, Elizabeth became queen. The crowds roared. The bells rang. But the girl who had lost everything to survive didn't see a crown. She saw a target, and she vowed no one would ever threaten her again. Her reign was brilliant, strategic, ruthless. She crushed threats with a smile, outplayed kings, danced with enemies. But there was one war. She could never win the war within her own heart. Elizabeth never married, never had children. She said she was married to England, but the truth was far darker. Every time she considered love, it turned to ash. Robert Dudley, her one true passion, was married when they met, when his wife was found dead at the bottom of a staircase. Rumors ignited. They said Elizabeth had orchestrated it, that she had blood on her hands. If she married him, she'd confirm the whispers. If she didn't, she'd be alone. She chose the crown and banished his second wife, her own cousin, from court forever. That's how Elizabeth loved. Through banishment, through silence, through absence. It was the only kind of love she knew. When her own cousins, the Grey sisters, married without her permission, Elizabeth had them imprisoned. One had 2 sons behind bars. Elizabeth didn't blink. Every child born to them was a threat to her throne. A reminder that she had no heir, no husband, no future beyond herself. And so she locked them away, tore families apart, and called it strategy. But behind the cold calculation was something more tragic: envy. The kind that eats you alive. By her 40s, Elizabeth's face began to change. The pockmarks from smallpox, the wrinkles from sleepless nights, the decay she couldn't allow the world to see. So she painted her skin with Venetian ceruse, a white cosmetic laced with lead and vinegar. It burned. It poisoned. But it covered the truth. They said she glowed like a goddess. In reality, her skin was dying, her mind faltering, her mood turning venomous. The more fragile she became, the more cruel she grew. Courtiers whispered that her wrath could freeze a room. Servants feared the sound of her footsteps. And yet, the world still bowed. In her final years, Elizabeth was both untouchable and utterly alone. The Virgin Queen, worshipped and feared. A woman who had rewritten the role of monarch through sheer will, forged a myth from pain, and made cruelty look like glory. But in truth, she was still that little girl watching her mother walk to the scaffold. Still, that teenager avoiding a man's footsteps in the dark. Still that prisoner in the tower, writing letters. No one answered. This is not a fairy tale. This is not Gloriana in golden robes. This is the story of a woman who chose power over everything because she had no other choice. And every crown has a cost. She was born on a Sunday morning, in the early light of the 7th day of September, in the year 1533. Beneath a sky that refused to celebrate, the child of Anne Boleyn and King Henry VIII was expected to be a boy, a son, who would quiet the storm that had torn England away from the Pope and broken the Queen, who came before. But when the baby cried, and they saw she was a girl, the silence in the corridors of Greenwich Palace was louder than any wail. They named her Elizabeth, a name that should have been soft and holy, but would become edged with iron. In that moment, 1,000 futures curled up and died, because to be born female in a kingdom that only worshipped sons was to be born already guilty. From her first breath, she was a contradiction. Swaddled in cloth of gold, laid in a cradle lined with silver and velvet, watched by maids who called her princess, Elizabeth was paraded like a jewel even as her mother's crown began to tilt. Anne Boleyn, once the most desired woman in England, now faced whispers of infertility, of witchcraft, of betrayal, and 11 days after Elizabeth turned 2, her mother walked barefoot to the scaffold in the Tower of London and knelt before the executioner. The sword was French. The cut was clean. But something deeper was severed that day. Elizabeth never saw her mother die, and never spoke of her, and never wrote her name in ink. But she wore a locket for the rest of her life with a portrait inside, hidden over her heart, like a bruise that never healed. Almost overnight, Elizabeth was declared illegitimate. Her household was dismantled. She was removed from the line of succession. And just like that, the cradle of satin became a cradle of shadows. She was not yet 3 years old. And already her name had been scratched from the official record like a stain that needed washing away. She was sent to Hatfield House, far from court, far from her father, far from everything but duty. There, she lived among strangers, who raised her not with kisses, but with caution. They taught her languages: Latin, Greek, French, and eventually Italian. They taught her how to read a room before she opened her mouth. They taught her how to smile without blinking and how to listen without reacting. But no one taught her how to grieve, because no one thought a bastard girl needed permission to cry. Her governess, Lady Margaret Bryan, once wrote that Elizabeth was a toward child, meaning she was quick-witted, eager, precocious. But what that truly meant was that Elizabeth learned to wear masks earlier than most. She had to. Her father, King Henry, had already moved on, marrying Jane Seymour a mere 11 days after Anne's execution. Within a year, Jane bore him a son, Edward, and Elizabeth was pushed even further from the center of power. Now nothing more than a spare girl with royal blood, and no mother to protect her. And yet, curiously, Elizabeth never turned on her father, even as he erased her. Even as he destroyed every portrait of Anne Boleyn, Elizabeth clung to the idea of him as a strong, golden monarch. Perhaps it was survival. Perhaps it was trauma. Or perhaps, deep down, she knew that to hate the king was to admit that no one was ever truly safe. And then, something shifted. In the autumn of the year, 1542, King Henry rode out to inspect his fortifications near the Essex coast, breathing in the salt air and, some say, reflecting on the daughters he had cast aside. He summoned both Mary and Elizabeth to join him at Havering at Bower. Elizabeth was 9 years old. Her eyes were sharp. Her curtsy was perfect. And Henry, perhaps struck by guilt, or boredom, or a rare flicker of affection, decided to restore both daughters to the line of succession, just behind their infant half-brother Edward. Parliament confirmed it in the Act of Succession in the year 1544, and Elizabeth was, once again, a princess. But nothing in her world was ever secure for long. In January of the year 1547, King Henry died. He left behind a 9-year-old son to inherit the crown, and a kingdom crawling with ambitious men. Elizabeth, now 13, had learned that everything could be taken away with a whisper. Her title, her safety, her family. She had also learned how to smile at her enemies and keep her secrets buried beneath a velvet gown. She walked through the halls of power like a ghost, dressed as a queen, and in the years that followed, she would become a living lesson in how to rise without being seen, how to wait without growing bitter, and how to survive in a court that viewed women as pawns or prizes, but never as players. When her stepmother Catherine Parr remarried, taking Thomas Seymour as her husband, Elizabeth moved into their household in Chelsea. What unfolded there would mark her forever, but that is a shadow reserved for another night. What matters now is this: before Elizabeth ever wore a crown, she wore abandonment like a second skin. Before she ever issued a royal decree, she learned that no word, no promise, no title could not be snatched away. Her childhood was not a cradle of roses, it was a minefield. And in that minefield, she learned to walk carefully, speak cautiously, and trust no one, not even herself. As she grew into womanhood, every glance, every silence, every dress she wore was part of a performance. The girl who had once been erased would become a queen who carved her image into marble, but underneath the powder and pearls, there would always be the child who stood at the edge of the scaffold, watching a crown roll across the floor like a dropped coin. There is a moment in every life when childhood ends, not with a birthday candle, but with a shadow crossing the doorway. And for Elizabeth, it happened in the quiet corridors of Chelsea House. When she was 14 years old, and the world around her still pretended she was a girl too young to understand danger. After the death of King Henry, in the cold month of January of the year 1547, Elizabeth was placed under the guardianship of her stepmother Catherine Parr. a woman she admired. A woman who had survived the king's temper and lived long enough to offer the princess something resembling affection. Catherine had just remarried. And with that marriage came Thomas Seymour, the brother of the former Queen Jane Seymour, the uncle of the child King Edward. A man known for his charm, his ambition, and a restlessness that clung to him like the smell of smoke. Chelsea House should have been a place of learning and safety. But instead, it became a place where Elizabeth's innocence began to unravel thread by thread. Thomas Seymour was no ordinary man in Elizabeth's world. He was handsome in the way dangerous men often are, with the kind of confidence that made servants lower their eyes and made young girls confuse attention with affection. He moved through the house like someone who believed he deserved everything he touched. And soon enough, he decided Elizabeth was something he could touch too. He began by entering her chamber at dawn, always in his nightgown, always before the household was awake. He claimed he came to open the curtains, to bring in the morning light, to joke with her as though she were still a child he could tease. But the jokes grew sharper, the touches bolder, the laughter wrong. He would sit on her bed, or tickle her sides, or slap her across the backside, as if it were harmless fun. And Elizabeth, trapped between fear and the desperate desire to keep her place in that household, it did what children in dangerous homes often do. She tried to pretend it didn't frighten her. Sometimes, Catherine Parr would be present, laughing awkwardly, joining in the play as though nothing was wrong. And that may have confused Elizabeth even more, because when the woman she trusted didn't stop it, how could she name it for what it was? How could she gather the words to describe a feeling that spread through her like cold water? Elizabeth was already a master at silence, and she wrapped that silence around herself now like armor. But the mornings became darker, the games more unsettling. Servants noticed that Elizabeth began rising earlier than usual, surrounding herself with her maids before sunrise, not out of comfort but out of caution. She was not safe alone. She knew it, even if she never said it. And yet she stayed. Because where else could she go? How could she accuse the Queen's husband without destroying herself? She was only 14, and the world did not belong to children, much less to girls. The truth pressed in like fog. She could not flee. She could not speak. She could only endure. And that endurance became another lesson, one she carried all the way to the throne. Everything changed one morning, when Catherine Parr entered the garden and saw her husband holding Elizabeth in an embrace that no man should ever have given a girl her age. Catherine's shock was sharp enough to cut the household in two. For the first time, she saw what had been happening, and the laughter vanished. The Queen, who had once giggled at these encounters, now saw the danger in her own home. Shame, grief, fear, whatever she felt, turned quickly into resolve. Elizabeth was removed from the house at once. Imagine the humiliation of that moment. Not a child being protected, but a girl being dismissed. Wrapped in the quiet implication that she had somehow been part of the problem, silence followed her, like a second shadow as she left Chelsea House. She was separated from the only maternal affection she had ever known. Punished, not just for the man's actions, but for being the girl who attracted them. In a world ruled by men, prey always bore the blame. And then came Catherine Parr's death in childbirth. In the late summer of the year 1548, Thomas Seymour, newly widowed, and wasted no time trying to secure Elizabeth again. But his intentions were not romantic in a way young girls dream about. They were political, calculated, and steeped in possibility. Marrying Elizabeth could have placed him dangerously close to the throne, and that made him reckless. He began scheming, corresponding, manipulating, gathering whispers like tools. It was only a matter of time before the council noticed, and when they did, the consequences came like thunder. Thomas Seymour was arrested and dragged to the tower. Elizabeth was questioned relentlessly, interrogated by men who wanted her to confess something, anything that would condemn him. She was stubborn, brilliant, terrified, but her silence, which she had trained from childhood, became her shield. She refused to incriminate herself or anyone else, refused to play the role of the weeping girl. One of her interrogators famously said, "I see guilt in her face. But guilt is not a crime. And without evidence, she could not be condemned." Thomas Seymour was executed on the 20th day of March, in the year 1549. They say he asked to see Elizabeth before he died. She refused, perhaps out of fear, perhaps out of disgust, or perhaps she already understood that showing emotion was dangerous. Whatever the reason, she turned her back on him. And in that act of refusal, a new version of herself began to form, harder, colder, sharper. This was the trauma no one dared name. Not in letters, not in court, not in her later years as queen. But it shaped her in ways that became visible only in adulthood. She grew wary of men, suspicious of affection, allergic to vulnerability. She mastered the art of distance. She turned flirtation into a political weapon, rather than a personal desire. She became the queen who would keep men dangling for decades without giving them anything real, not because she enjoyed cruelty, but because she had learned what happened when a man decided he had the right to take what he wanted. The girl, Thomas Seymour, cornered in a bedroom, became the woman who refused to marry any man alive. The world would later call her the Virgin Queen. As though celibacy were a crown, she chose willingly. As though she found pride in the emptiness where love should have lived. But the truth sits in the shadows of Chelsea House, in the echo of footsteps on stone floors at dawn, in the terror of waking before a man could open your curtains. In that house, at 14, Elizabeth learned that desire could be dangerous, that affection could be a trap, and that sometimes love was just another word for power. And she would never forget it. The sky was gray on the morning she entered the Tower of London. Not weeping, not trembling, and just watching her own shadow move across the stone, like a ghost rehearsing its final act. It was the 18th day of March, in the year 1554, and Elizabeth Tudor had just been accused of conspiring to overthrow her own sister. The bells did not ring for her arrival. There were no crowds, only the iron creak of the gates as they swallowed her whole. And the same gates her mother had walked through 18 years earlier, when the world still believed in justice and executioners still bowed before they swung. Elizabeth did not cry. She was too well trained for that. Instead, she looked up at the towers and the black windows and the invisible blood in the mortar, and smiled just faintly. Just enough to tell them she was watching. She had learned this trick from the ones who had tried to break her before. If you look afraid, they press harder. If you beg, they let you rot longer. So instead, she stood still as the soldiers surrounded her, stood straight as they led her across the bridge, and said nothing when the door shut behind her. The air in the tower was thicker than any she had ever breathed. It smelled of oil, of damp parchment, of unwashed secrets. She was 20 years old and already understood that silence was armor, and dignity could be a weapon sharper than steel. It hadn't started with her. It had started with a whisper, like so many royal deaths do. Mary, her half-sister, had announced she would marry Philip of Spain, a Catholic prince, the son of an empire, a stranger with armies behind him. The people had murmured. The nobles had plotted. And then came Thomas Wyatt, swords in hand, shouting, rebellion for the Protestant cause. His uprising failed. Heads rolled, and the Queen looked across her court and saw not just enemies but rivals, and Elizabeth was the brightest threat of all. She had always known Mary would hate her, not because she was cruel, but because she was young, Protestant, beloved, the favorite of their late father. She didn't need to raise a sword to make herself dangerous, she just had to exist. And that, more than anything, was enough to send her to the Tower. When they told her she was to be arrested, Elizabeth claimed she was too ill to travel. She delayed for days, hoping someone, anyone, would intervene. No one did. And so she stepped onto the barge that would carry her to the place where traitors died and queens vanished. It is said she wrote a letter to Mary along the way, pleading her innocence, declaring her loyalty, swearing before God that she had not conspired. But Mary did not answer. She had stopped answering the moment she became queen. They placed Elizabeth in the bell tower, not far from where her mother had spent her last days. The bed was clean. The room was quiet. The walls were too thick for screams. She counted the steps in the hall, counted the guards, counted the days. It was Easter when she realized no one had come to see her smile in a week, and it was then that fear finally touched her spine. Quiet and cold. She knew what happened to women who were too clever, to girls who attracted loyalty. She had seen it with Lady Jane Grey. She had smelled it in her mother's blood. And so she did what she had always done. She endured. They interrogated her carefully, not with whips, not with torture, but with silence, with careful questions, with men who already believed she was guilty. One of them, Sir Robert Tyrwhitt, wrote that he could see guilt in her face, even as she spoke. But Elizabeth gave them nothing. No names, no confessions, no tremble in her voice. She folded herself into patience and waited. Outside the Tower, the court began to fracture. Some lords begged for her release. Others plotted her death. Mary hesitated. Perhaps she remembered once riding into London beside her sister. Perhaps she feared making a martyr. Or perhaps she simply wanted more time. Whatever the reason, the axe did not fall. On the 19th day of May, 18 years to the day since Anne Boleyn had died, Elizabeth was released from the Tower. They marched her out beneath a sky too bright for comfort. And for a moment she looked back, not to thank the building for sparing her, but to remember how it felt to stare at death and refuse to blink. From there, she was sent into house arrest, watched day and night, a prisoner in all but name. But the Tower had taught her something house arrest never could: how to smile like she had nothing to fear. Even when she was drowning in it, the fear never left her after that. It simply became a part of her bloodstream. Like iron, like poison. Every woman who stood too close, every lord who whispered too loudly, every cousin who married without her permission, she watched them with Tower eyes. The kind that see threats where others see love. The kind that remember how fast a throne can turn to a grave. Elizabeth walked out of the Tower alive. But she would never again walk without armor. Not physical, but emotional, strategic, lethal. The girl who had once been cast aside and caged now understood the cost of survival. And she was willing to make others pay it in her place. They said he was handsome, with eyes too quick to trust, and a smile that lingered just long enough to be dangerous. His name was Robert Dudley, and for nearly 40 years, he would be the closest thing to love Elizabeth Tudor ever allowed herself to have baked. But she never wore his ring. She never let the world call her his, and everyone else who dared to love him, they paid for it dearly. They had known each other since childhood. Both born under the shadow of Henry VIII. Both raised in the same glittering court of fear and favor. But it wasn't until Elizabeth became queen in the year 1558 that something shifted. He became master of the horse, a position of honor and of proximity. His chamber was moved beside hers. Their daily meetings blurred into moonlit conversations. Thomas Seymour was no ordinary man in Elizabeth's world. He was handsome in the way dangerous men often are, with the kind of confidence that made servants lower their eyes and made young girls confuse attention with affection. He moved through the house like someone who believed he deserved everything he touched. And soon enough, he decided Elizabeth was something he could touch too. He began by entering her chamber at dawn. Always in his nightgown. Always before the household was awake. There were no witnesses. And though Robert was cleared of wrongdoing, the stain never lifted. The Queen could not marry a man whose wife had died so conveniently. If she did, they would say she had planned it, that she had killed for love, that she had blood under her crown. So she didn't marry him, but she didn't let him go. Either, he stayed beside her. Decade after decade, he commanded her armies, rode beside her through plague and rebellion, sat near her throne at court, and closer still when the curtains fell. But still, she would not say yes. The years turned, and her advisors grew restless. They begged her to marry, to secure the realm, to give England an heir, to settle the succession. She would listen, nod, smile, and then offer silence. Because how could she marry a man the world already believed she had killed for? How could she marry at all? When marriage meant submission, obedience, vulnerability. Elizabeth had survived too much to hand over her crown or her heart. But not everyone respected her boundary. In the year 1578, Robert Dudley did something unforgivable. He married again, not just any woman but Lettice Knollys, Elizabeth's own cousin, one of her ladies-in-waiting, a Tudor by blood, and a mirror of everything Elizabeth had been before the throne, beautiful, bold, and loved. They married in secret. He didn't tell the Queen. He didn't ask. Elizabeth found out, and when she did, something inside her snapped. She banished Lettice from court immediately. Lettice never returned. Her social standing was ruined. Her family's prospects withered. She saw it for what it was, a threat swaddled in linen. The child, named Edward like so many before him, was not a prince. He was a weapon, a possibility, a baby that Parliament might rally behind if the Queen faltered, and that made him dangerous. And his mother, unforgivable. So the Queen kept Catherine in the Tower, kept Edward Seymour away from her. And when they begged to be allowed to see each other just once, Elizabeth allowed it only long enough for them to conceive a second son. Elizabeth's world was made of threats she could never name, and decisions she could never explain. She ruled alone, in a world where kings ruled always. And she understood deeply that if any woman too close to her found happiness, marriage, or motherhood, it would reflect like a curse against her image. She had chosen to be the Virgin Queen. She had made herself into myth, and myths do not bleed. They do not marry. They do not lose. So she punished the women who reminded her that she had lost something real. Not just Lettice, Catherine Grey, Mary Grey, Lady Essex, any woman who married without permission, who bore children, who smiled too openly in the presence of men. The Queen watched each of them felt the sharp end of Elizabeth's wrath. But no one more than Lettice, because Lettice had touched what Elizabeth had kept locked away, had held it, claimed it, worn it like a crown of her own, and Elizabeth had watched it slip through her fingers. When Robert Dudley died in the year 1588, Elizabeth locked herself in her chamber for days. She did not eat. She did not speak. She simply stared at the wall. No one was allowed to enter. Her heart, though never publicly given, had been buried with him. He left behind a letter, calling her my most dear and most loved. She kept it in a box beside her bed until the day she died. It was never about purity. It was never about virtue. It was about control, about survival, about making sure no one could take from her what she had built. But the cost was staggering. She ruled a kingdom, but she lost the man she loved. She silenced women who only wanted what she could not give herself. She wrapped her pain in velvet and lace, and called it majesty. And through it all, she never wore a ring. It was never enough for her to be queen. Not when every cradle in the kingdom echoed the sound of what she would never give. Not when every baby born into a Tudor-adjacent womb became a whisper of doubt in Parliament's ear. A question asked too loudly in dark corners. Who comes next? Elizabeth had no child. She would have no child, and so every cousin with a fertile body and a hidden surname became a possible threat, a seed of replacement, a shadow dragging behind her silk train. And when they married without her consent, when they dared to fall in love without her blessing, Elizabeth struck not with blade, but with silence, stone, and locked doors. As the years passed and the men around her grayed, bloated, and died, Elizabeth remained unchanging, untouchable, pale, regal. Her skin shone like marble, her lips like lacquer. Her cheeks never withered. But it was a lie. A brilliant, lethal, slow-burning lie made from white lead, vinegar, crushed eggshell, mercury, and fear. The face of the Virgin Queen was a mask, and that mask was killing her. It began after the smallpox. In the year 1562, there is a moment in every life when childhood ends. Not with a birthday candle, but with a shadow crossing the doorway. And for Elizabeth, it happened in the quiet corridors of Chelsea House. When she was 14 years old, and the world around her still pretended she was a girl too young to understand danger, and she had a womb that worked. When Elizabeth found out Catherine had married in secret, without her permission, her fury did not arrive like thunder. It arrived like frost. Cold, slow, lethal. She had them both imprisoned, Catherine and Edward. No trial, no pardon, no public shame, only iron and isolation. And when Catherine, already pregnant, gave birth to a son behind locked doors, the Queen did not celebrate the arrival of new Tudor blood. That was enough. The second child sealed their fate. Two Tudor boys, born in confinement, raised in the shadow of a throne they would never touch. Catherine died young, her health broken by grief and childbirth. Her husband, too, was never truly freed. They were not executed. That would have been merciful. They were forgotten, buried alive in Elizabeth's silence. But Catherine was not the only one. Her younger sister, Mary Grey, followed the same path, and myths, once shaped, cannot bend. So she locked them away, one by one, not always behind iron bars, but behind banishment, behind broken alliances, behind the quiet terror of being erased from royal memory. The punishment was never swift. It was slow, methodical, terribly personal. Because Elizabeth didn't need to kill you to destroy you. She only needed you to remember that she could, at court, People learned to fear her smile. She saw it for what it was, a threat swaddled in linen. The child, named Edward like so many before him, was not a prince. He was a weapon, a possibility, a baby that Parliament might rally behind if the Queen faltered, and that made him dangerous. And his mother, unforgivable. So the Queen kept Catherine in the tower, kept Edward Seymour away from her. And when they begged to be allowed to see each other just once, Elizabeth allowed it only long enough for them to conceive a second son. His uprising failed. Heads rolled, and the Queen looked across her court and saw not just enemies but rivals, and Elizabeth was the brightest threat of all. She had always known Mary would hate her, not because she was cruel, but because she was young, Protestant, beloved, the favorite of their late father. She didn't need to raise a sword to make herself dangerous. She just had to exist. And that, more than anything, was enough to send her to the tower, to weigh their words before they asked for permission to marry. Love became a negotiation. Loyalty was measured in celibacy. Women whispered warnings to each other behind. Fans do not wed without the Queen's blessing, or you will find your wedding gown replaced with mourning black. And yet, despite all this, they kept marrying, kept falling in love, kept bearing children, because the heart, unlike the crown, does not answer to fear. And so Elizabeth, year by year, watched herself become more isolated, more hardened. Her court shimmered with jewels, but her inner circle shrank. The world saw Gloriana, the Virgin Queen, the radiant monarch who had chosen England over everything. But behind the gold and the velvet sat a woman who had buried every threat that dared to be happy. And some of them had once called her cousin. She told the world she was immortal, not in words, perhaps, but in powder, in polish, in silence. The cinnabar blush masked the hollowing cheeks. A touch of cochineal on her lips gave the illusion of youth. It was a queen's alchemy turning rot into radiance. But the elements were poison. Lead sank into her bloodstream. Drop by drop, day after day, mercury burned her skin, blistered it, scarred it further, and yet she wore it longer, layer upon layer, thick enough to crack when she smiled, thick enough to hide the woman beneath. Elizabeth had ruled only 4 years when the fever hit. She survived barely, but the illness left her scarred, tiny pits across her once flawless skin. Her hair thinned, her strength faded, and in a court where image was power, imperfection was a weakness she could not afford. So she reached for the powder jar, and then she never stopped. They called it Venetian ceruse. To some, it was just makeup, but for Elizabeth, it became armor. The white base blurred the scars, because the illusion mattered more than truth. It wasn't vanity. Not entirely. It was survival. Elizabeth was her image. A woman ruling alone. In a world that called women emotional, erratic, too weak to lead. If they saw her falter, if they saw her decay, they would circle her like wolves. So she smiled, with lead on her cheeks and poison in her blood, and let them call her Gloriana. But the mask had rules. She could never appear without it, not even in private. For Elizabeth was not just hiding age, she was hiding grief, loneliness, the ravages of regret. Every morning, the mirror became a battlefield, and victory meant vanishing her own face. Her ladies watched in silence. They helped mix the compounds. They applied the salves. They peeled the paint when it turned to crust. At court, no one dared speak of the Queen's changing form. The nose that thinned, the lips that dried, the breath that grew foul. Only whispers clung to the stone walls that her teeth had rotted, that her gums bled, that her voice trembled when no one watched. She was 50 when the tremors began. Memory slipped. Her stomach churned. Her moods darkened. She flew into rages over gowns, over jewels, over words that echoed too loud. Sometimes, she wept without warning. Other times, she fell into silence so absolute that courtiers thought her ill. But she would always return, powdered, painted, perfect, because the illusion mattered more than truth. It wasn't vanity. Not entirely. It was survival. Elizabeth was her image, a woman ruling alone, in a world that called women emotional, erratic, too weak to lead. If they saw her falter, if they saw her decay, they would circle her like wolves. So she smiled, with lead on her cheeks and poison in her blood, and let them call her Gloriana. But the mask had rules. She could never appear without it, not even in private. Visitors were not allowed into her chamber until she had been painted. Mirrors were draped in cloth, and as time wore on, the mask grew thicker, heavier, until she no longer remembered the face beneath. It had been swallowed by the crown. Some nights, she would not sleep. She would pace the corridors of Whitehall or Richmond Palace, wrapped in silk, her face glinting in candlelight like porcelain about to crack. Servants stayed out of sight. They knew her fury came sharper after sunset, and those who failed to praise her beauty paid in silence or exile. Still, the poison worked its way in. By her 60s, she was suffering. Chronic pain, memory loss, insomnia, swelling in her joints, blackness in her teeth. Her hair thinned to wisps, so she wore elaborate red wigs. Her breath soured. Her digestion failed. Yet, still, every morning, she sat at her mirror and allowed the transformation to begin again. There was no turning back. She had made herself a myth, and myths do not age. In private moments, those closest to her sometimes saw the cracks. Robert Cecil, her most trusted minister, once wrote of her in her final years, "She is not as she was. She is becoming a creature of fear and mirrors." But no one could stop her, because Elizabeth believed in the mask more than she believed in her own flesh. To remove it was to reveal the truth, and the truth, by then, was too terrible to speak aloud. And so she painted herself through grief, through war, but she still wore the mask. They had to lift it from her face to prepare her body for burial. And when they did, what they saw made even the most hardened servants flinch. She had rotted beneath her own legend, but England never saw that. The people mourned a queen whose beauty never faded, whose youth had lasted half a century. They mourned a marble goddess, not the woman who had bled beneath the powder. And that, perhaps, was her final victory. She died as Gloriana, but she lived and suffered as Elizabeth. A crown is heavy enough when worn alone, but it becomes unbearable when there's no one to inherit it. Elizabeth had ruled for years, ruled well, ruled with flame and silk and silence. But the question loomed larger with every passing season. Whispered in Parliament, echoed in cathedrals, carved into the very walls of Whitehall. Who comes next, for all her power, for all her beauty sculpted in white lead? She had no child, and a kingdom without an heir is a feast for vultures. The pressure began early. Even before she was crowned, ambassadors were already measuring her hand for marriage. The throne of England was not just hers, it was a prize. and every suitor saw it as a gateway to power, to influence, to legacy. But Elizabeth had been taught, again and again, what marriage cost a woman. Her sister Mary had married Philip of Spain, and in return England was dragged into wars it did not want. Her cousin Mary, Queen of Scots, had married for politics and been devoured by betrayal. Her mother, Anne Boleyn, had married a king and lost her head. Elizabeth had learned, and she would not be like them. But saying no was never simple. First came the Protestant princes from the cold north. Eric of Sweden, handsome, ambitious, and, most importantly, far away. His letters were filled with poetry. His gifts were extravagant, but he was distant in more than geography. He saw her as a possession to be won, a jewel for his crown. Elizabeth smiled, responded politely, and let the courtship die in the frost. Then came the Archduke Charles of Austria, cousin to Philip of Spain, a Catholic, polished, royal to his bones. For years, the match was discussed in careful tones. But Elizabeth knew the danger. Charles came from a family that believed queens were wives first, rulers second. She had not clawed her way through betrayal and imprisonment to become a figurehead. So she said no, again, and again, and again. Each refusal chipped away at her image in Parliament. They wanted stability. They wanted a husband who could fight wars, produce sang, protect the bloodline. Elizabeth gave them poetry instead, wit, control, and in return, they grew restless. They began looking elsewhere toward her cousins, toward the Grey children, toward Mary Queen of Scots. Because Lettice had touched what Elizabeth had kept locked away, had held it, claimed it, worn it, like a crown of her own, and Elizabeth had watched it slip through her fingers. When Robert Dudley died in the year 1588, Elizabeth locked herself in her chamber for days. She did not eat. She did not speak. She simply stared at the wall. No one was allowed to enter. Her heart, though never publicly given, had been buried with him. Visitors were not allowed into her chamber until she had been painted. Mirrors were draped in cloth, and as time wore on, the mask grew thicker, heavier, until she no longer remembered the face beneath. It had been swallowed by the crown. Some nights, she would not sleep. She would pace the corridors of Whitehall or Richmond Palace, wrapped in silk, her face glinting in candlelight, like porcelain about to crack. Servants stayed out of sight. They knew her fury came sharper after sunset. Alone, in the final years, the great queen no longer shone. She flickered. The woman once hailed as Gloriana, the Virgin Queen, the Lioness of England, now walked the corridors of Richmond Palace in silence. Wrapped in heavy robes, she no longer had the strength to carry. Her skin, beneath the layers of white lead and rouge, had grayed and cracked like old parchment. Her once fiery red wigs no longer fit her scalp, now thin and bruised from years of poison. Her teeth were gone, because Lettice had touched what Elizabeth had kept locked away, had held it, claimed it, worn it, like a crown of her own, and Elizabeth had watched it slip through her fingers. When Robert Dudley died in the year 1588, Elizabeth locked herself in her chamber for days. She did not eat. She did not speak. She simply stared at the wall. No one was allowed to enter. Her heart, though never publicly given, had been buried with him. She would sit for hours, unmoving, staring at the wall. Ministers came and went. She refused to speak, refused to sleep. "I will not go to bed," she whispered. "If I lie down, I will never rise again. And she was right. She had lived her life mastering control over her body, her heart, her court, her country. But in death, she could control nothing. Her body betrayed her. Her mind unraveled. She would sit for hours, unmoving, staring at the wall. Ministers came and went. She refused to speak, refused to sleep. I will not go to bed, she whispered. If I lie down, I will never rise again. And she was right. She had lived her life mastering control over her body, her heart, her court, her country. But in death, she could control nothing. Her body betrayed her. Her mind unraveled. James of Scotland took the throne. Son of the very merry Queen of Scots, Elizabeth had ordered executed. At first, they hoped he would bring new life, new heirs, new glory. But his court was foreign. His favorites were corrupt. His rule lacked magic. And slowly, the people began to remember her, not as she truly was, but as they wanted her to be. The cult of Gloriana was born not in life, but in disappointment, and behind the marble statues and sonnets was the real woman, Elizabeth Tudor, the child who watched her mother executed, the teenager who feared the touch of men, the prisoner who wrote letters no one answered, the queen who exiled her own blood for falling in love, the woman who powdered her skin until it bled, who ruled a court of mirrors and shadows, who chose power over joy every time. She was not perfect. She was magnificent. She was not kind. She was brilliant. She was not untouched. She was scarred, and yet, she ruled for 44 years, longer than any Tudor, longer than any queen before her. She kept England Protestant. She defeated an empire. She survived. But she burned with rage, with loneliness, with silence, burned so fiercely that no one dared come too close. And those who did rarely returned whole. Her legacy was not a bloodline. It was a warning, a masterpiece carved from pain. In the end, she gave her country a golden age, but gave herself nothing. No love, no child, no peace, only fire.